Well, hello, welcome, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning into Facebook Live for the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Coffee with a Survivor series. My name is Deana Kobrynski, and I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I am pleased to share this important story of survival during World War II that is not well known. Much of the stories revolving around the Holocaust revolve around those that perished in the concentration camps. However, millions of people also died due to the policies of the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. From 1939 to 1941, about 750,000 Polish citizens, including Polish Jews, were arrested and deported by Stalin. Many were lost in labor camps, including Polish Jews, and also died due to starvation and disease. One of those was my father, Dr. Borys Kobrynski. He was among the lucky ones to have survived. The following tells his story. But first, I'd like to ask you a question. Have you ever considered the value of a piece of paper? Think about this question as you listen to the story. You'll find out in a bit. My father, Dr. Borys Kobrynski, was a Jewish medical doctor who not only survived the trials of persecution in pre-World War II Poland, then war and oppression under Stalin, but saved his family, and despite being a refugee, became eminent in his profession. Sounds like some sort of superhero, huh? To me, he was simply my dad, and kind of an enigma. I grew up in what you could call an idyllic childhood in upstate New York. Although at the time I didn't really think our family was different, we were. My father was old enough to be my grandfather and spoke with a very thick accent. My mother, who was much younger, was American. He Jewish, she a Lutheran from the Midwest. Here's their wedding photo. The only differences that I felt were when we visited my father's cousin in Brooklyn each year for Passover, and every other year flew to France to visit my father's mother, brothers, and cousins who spoke only French and Yiddish, the language typically spoken by Eastern European Jews pre-World War II. It was strange to write postcards to my little friends from my grandmother's apartment in Nice. As I got older, I heard bits and pieces of my dad's life in pre-World War II Europe. They lived in Vilna, which is now Vilnius, Lithuania. But still, thinking like a teenager, I couldn't understand why he was so dreadfully worried about my sister and I. My mother, and I thank her for this every day, pushed him to write his memoirs for his daughters. I was in 8th grade at the time. He would spend hours writing in his den, and whenever I come home from school, there he'd be. I don't think he knew how long and involved this project would be. He said that this book was a chronicle of medical practices in the 7 countries he had lived in: Poland, Lithuania, Russia, France, Israel, Canada, and finally the US. His behavior never became overtly depressed during this period. Well, I think my teenage angst must have snapped him out of any PTSD. Unfortunately, he never finished the book, as he died when I was 19. He was then 75 years old. After his death, I didn't have the heart to read his handwritten memoirs, which were over 15 notebooks, at least 15 notebooks, until after I graduated from college. As I read, I had the overwhelming sense of disbelief that my father had gone through all the adversities he had faced. During this time, my sister and I went through his papers. We found a yellowed piece of paper in Polish that looked like it had been an official document. You see this on screen over here. It had been folded many times, as it had been taped up in the places where it had been folded. Here's a closer look. In this photo, you'll see how worn it is. Since neither of us spoke Polish, I needed to refer back to his memoirs. To my surprise, this folded up piece of paper was his medical degree. Why did he keep this piece of paper, which was over 50 years old? In my search to comprehend my father, I went to France and Israel to interview my uncles and his medical colleagues. I also visited Vilnius, Lithuania, which is where he had lived. But it was in his memoirs where I found the answers. Dr. Borys Kobrynski was born in 1908 in what we now call Poland. Here's a screenshot of the Russian Empire to show you the area where he lived in or was born in. There were no birth records, but his family said he was born in a town called Siels. My grandparents, my father and his three brothers moved to Vilna, known as the Jerusalem of Eastern Europe, and which is now Vilnius, Lithuania. They ran a hotel and then opened a fabric shop. Through their hard work, they became wealthy. My grandfather, shown here with my grandmother, joined the Zionist movement for the establishment of a Jewish state now called Israel, even publishing the Zionist daily newspaper. After World War I, when Poland was established as a nation, Vilna became part of Poland and was renamed Vilno. When he became older, my father faced head-on anti-Semitic policies and practices. What you see on screen are articles in Polish telling people not to buy from Jews or to vote for Jews in the elections. The Polish established university had quotas for Jews, so two of his brothers and one cousin emigrated to France. However, my father found a loophole to enter the medical school. If he received a master's degree in another subject, the fact that he was Jewish was overlooked. So after getting a degree in mathematics, he entered the medical school. Ethnic groups were treated differently for student lodging and even seating in the classroom. Lodging was suspiciously full when Jews applied, and they were segregated from the other students in the classroom. Here is a photo of one of the student anti-Jewish protests. At one point, the Jewish medical students protested the segregation of seats by standing in the back of the classroom. As the Nazis gained power in Germany, their anti-Jewish toxin expanded into Poland and anti-Semitic protests increased. I believe it's best described in my father's own words. Here's an excerpt from his memoirs.
The last years of the pre-war Polish Republic, 1936 to 1939, were sorry years for the Jewish citizens of Poland. In Vilna, the racial hatred was increasing. A boycott of Jewish businesses was propagated by Polish right-wingers. It affected my father's business, which began to lose Polish clients. Every day, physical attacks on Jews became more frequent. Most of the Jewish population resided in a district of Vilna located in the middle of the city. It was unsafe for a Jew to walk the streets outside the Jewish district. The streets of this district were solidly inhabited by Jews. There also were located the Jewish houses of worship, commercial enterprises, and small industries. The anti-Jewish mob did not venture into the Jewish streets. Nevertheless, even the Jewish streets were not completely safe. My father, Deana Kobrynski, was an owner of a large store of fabrics for men and women. The store was located on Niemiecka Street, a well-known street in the commercial center of the city. Most, if not all, of the stores on this street belonged to Jews. It was considered to be a safe street. However, in 1936, when the anti-Jewish riots became frequent, the Jewish merchants, as a sign of protest, closed the stores for one day. The authorities did not like it because the protests created too much attention in Western Europe and the U.S. The police were sent to counter the protest. I had clinics as usual on that day of the protest. When I got home, I found my father in bed with several bruises on his face and body. I learned that he was standing peacefully beside his closed store when he was attacked by a policeman. The policeman beat him with a nightstick, yelling, "This is for you, Jewish merchant. You will now know for what you are protesting." It was particularly disturbing to us, the fact that this particular policeman was a client of my father's store, and the policeman knew my father well. The anti-Jewish propaganda became completely irrational. The anti-Semites painted the Jews as great enemies of Poland and called the Polish masses to fight the Jews. They disregarded completely the reality that Hitler was massing his armies on the western border of Poland and was demanding the return to Germany of the Port Gdansk or Danzig and the Polish corridor. Border skirmishes and provocations were frequent. The Polish government, while aware of the Nazi threat to Poland, did nothing to calm the anti-Jewish movement. At the end of August 1939, we knew that the war was imminent. There was a general mobilization of the reserve army. Of the doctors working in the city hospital, 1 or 2 were drafted. Soon it became obvious that Poland was not prepared for war. There was a shortage of uniforms and arms to equip all draftees. At times, I saw an army unit passing by with a few soldiers in civilian shoes and few carrying rifles. On September 1st, 1939, the German army invaded Poland without declaring war. Early in the morning of that day, we heard explosions. We learned that the German airplanes bombed the military airport in Vilna. Our city had no military significance, and the bombings were only to create panic among the civilian population. In this, the Germans succeeded. In the middle of September 1939, Soviet troops entered Poland from the east. Vilna was close to the eastern border and was occupied on the first day of the invasion of the Soviet troops into the eastern part of Poland. They did not encounter any resistance. We knew in advance because of rumors that something was going to happen. The streets were deserted. Houses were barricaded, and the stores' windows and doors were protected with iron gates. The Jewish population was prepared for the worst, fearing mob attacks. Fortunately, this did not happen.
Before I continue sharing from my father's memoirs, I'd like to give you some historical context. On September 1st, 1939, Germans did invade Poland from the west. And Hitler's army did not go as far as Vilna. As you can see from the map, Vilna is the furthest east city located in Poland. It's circled in blue. Because in August 1939, Hitler and Joseph Stalin, again, the leader of the Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact, which was an agreement for them not to attack each other. What wasn't known was there was a secret agreement. It was in which they divided Poland in half. Here you see the demarcation line. They wanted the whole of Eastern Europe split between them. So basically, they agreed to split Poland between them. After the Soviets invaded Vilna, they made a show of handing Vilna over to Lithuania as the historic capital, renaming the city Vilnius. Things went on as before. My father was able to find a job as a director of a health center in one of the towns near Vilna. But after a year of relative calm, the Sovietization of Vilna began. My father describes it in his memoirs.
It began with the nationalization of business and industry, and done in 2 stages. First, all stores and factories were put under the management of a government-appointed commissar. The owner was invited to work in the enterprise and receive a moderate pay. All bank accounts were frozen. After a month or so, the final stage went into effect. The owner was told that he would not bother to come to work anymore. All businesses were declared officially owned by the people. The government appointees were managers on behalf of the people. The capitalist owners had exploited the working masses for too long, and therefore they did not deserve any compensation for their business. In this way, my father was deprived of his business without compensation.
After I read those words for the first time, it made me think, and it still makes me think, that this was the beginning of the end of life in Vilna for my father and his parents. I still can't imagine, even now, 80 years later, how devastating it must have been for my grandfather and grandmother to be stripped of a business that they had built. Well, I guess after all the pogroms they lived through, which were massacres of the Jews by the Russians, It was just another injustice they had to endure. It got even worse for them, and the following episodes will explain how my father's medical diploma becomes important. It all started in the spring of 1941 when my father noted that the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, were in his local town hall making lists. He became afraid that his father, a shop owner, would be arrested, so he had his parents move in with him. Here you see on screen is a list of all the shopkeepers in Vilna, and the third line highlighted is my grandfather, Deana Kobrynski. And sklep is the word for shop in Polish. So my father's own words again describe what happens next in vivid detail.
On June 14th, 1941, early in the morning, I heard rumors that in a summer resort area, Charny Bois, not far from Rudomina, NKVD men were rounding up refugees. People arriving from Vilna told me that NKVD troops were going from house to house, detaining capitalists, known Zionists, Bundists, and refugees, whatever their political affiliation. I was glad that my parents were with me in Rudomina, where I thought they were safe. As usual, I went to work at the health center and came home in the early afternoon. We had just finished eating when my mother looked through the window and said, "We have unwelcome guests." Indeed, I saw a truck parked at the entrance to our house, carrying military men wearing NKVD uniforms. I could not imagine they had any business to see me, a physician, unless one of them was ill. We opened the door and 3 NKVD officers with guns in hand entered the room. I asked, "Who are you looking for?" One of them took out a paper in which it said that they came to take my parents and their son, myself, and to transport us to the railway station in Vilaika, a suburb of Vilna. They gave us 1 hour to pack suitcases. They had spent too much time looking for us in Vilna, and therefore, if we were not ready in 1 hour, they would take us without luggage. Now I understood what had happened. The NKVD began to work on the preparation of lists of undesirable elements quite early, as soon as Lithuania was proclaimed a Soviet republic in August 1940. The lists dealt not with individuals, but with families, and my name was put on the list at that time because of my father. My parents' move into my home had not changed anything.
Go.
The NKVD people told us to take only the most necessary things because we were going on a trip. The Soviet government had decided to give us a new residence in another Soviet republic. We should not worry about the furniture and other belongings. This would be sold and the money sent to our new address. NKVD would send appraisers who would make a list of all our belongings in Rudomina and the apartment in Vilna. Under the circumstances, this seemed fair. However, we soon learned that in practice, nobody received a dime from things left at home. Interestingly enough, we encountered later transports with people displaced like us, who had packed all their belongings in big trucks and took everything except large pieces of furniture. In some transports, we saw farming families with cows placed in the same cars as people. We encountered a hostile attitude, and therefore we finished with a few personal things for the trip. The only fortunate event for me was that I had saved a few thousand rubles that I kept at home. I was told that I could keep Russian money, but foreign currency and gold coins would be confiscated. The NKVD scrutinized all papers and documents that I had at home. They allowed me to keep my university diplomas and personal documents. My university diplomas proved later much more valuable than any gold coins. The 14th of June was really a dark day, and another shock awaited us when we arrived at the railway station. There we were told that by order of some tribunal in Moscow, my father's destination was different from my mother's and mine, so we were separated. It took almost a year before we were reunited. My father was placed on a train that took him to a labor camp in the Urals. The NKVD actually had 2 lists of enemies of the people. On one were criminals who had to be punished by hard labor. These were capitalists whose businesses had been nationalized or persons active in political parties. My father scored on both points. On the second list, families of such people were invited to take up residence in another republic of the Soviet Union, preferably deep in the Soviet Union. The Soviet authorities considered it unsafe to keep them in an area close to the border of Germany. In their paranoia, the Soviets considered that within the capitalist class there might be hidden fascist spies. The Soviets assumed always that it was safer to punish 100 innocent persons than to let one potential spy escape. It was beyond the point that this large group of innocent persons consisted of Jews, who would hardly spy for Nazi Germany. The NKVD did not engage in fine distinctions. And so one convoy took my father to one train, while my mother and I were escorted to another train. It would take almost a year for us to be reunited. Vilna was a station where merchandise and cattle trains were loaded. It was a large station. One could see thousands of people who were being loaded in the trains. Each train was surrounded by NKVD units. My mother and I were loaded in a large car that was ordinarily used for transporting cattle. The car was relatively clean. On both ends of the car were placed 2 levels of wooden planks. We were told to occupy 2 spaces on the planks. These would serve for sleeping. We deposited our few suitcases on the planks and went to the wide open door to see what was going on. New people were still arriving and loaded in the trains. Our car was slowly filled up until we counted 60 people. Among people in the car were a few families whom we knew well. Their story was similar to ours. The head of the family was a known businessman. The business had been nationalized. The head of the family was on the same train as my father, destined to go to a labor camp, the dreaded Gulag. The family members were with us. They lived in Vilna and told us that during the whole day, trucks with NKVD men were circulating on the streets of Vilna and transporting people to the train station. Our train remained in the station that day, and we departed only in the afternoon of the next day, June 15, 1941. The morning of June 15th, we noticed close relatives and friends who finally discovered where we were and came to see us. They brought food and clothing. The NKVD convoy surrounded the train and did not let other persons approach the train. Nevertheless, we could exchange words with our relatives. Our relatives were very distressed. We already passed the initial shock of being uprooted and thrown in a cattle train, but for our relatives it was a real calamity to see us under these circumstances. Little did they know their fate would be much worse than ours. Except for one cousin who survived a Nazi extermination camp, all other relatives living in Vilna perished in the Holocaust.
It's powerful for me to share with you this chapter in my father's life. As I read those words, I couldn't believe the horror of the event, which he explains quite calmly. My father, with some clothes, a bit of food, and his personal documents, was deported to who knows where. Along with his elderly mother. As you can see from this map of the deportation routes, they traveled a very long distance. After a 15-day train trip, they were in the interior of the Soviet Union, close to China. And they were let off at a farm camp where they were expected to work. When the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, these refugees were considered allies to the Soviets and once again Polish citizens. They were allowed to leave the camp and settle wherever they wanted except major cities like Moscow. They learned from other Polish refugees that a Polish embassy was opened and would take care of all citizens. My father and grandmother were advised to leave and go south, where it would be warmer and where the embassy wished to concentrate all Polish citizens. In this map, the yellow arrows show the trajectory of the refugees. They eventually made it to a town called Zambul, which is in today's Kazakhstan. My father and grandmother arrived at a railway station settlement. basically a town with mud huts, with straw roofs, and unpaved roads. There was a large influx of refugees from the western part of the Soviet Union, of people who were running away from the German armies, and a large number of people deported by the NKVD. It wasn't easy for them to find a room, although a Polish center was set up for the 20,000 Polish refugees, where he inquired about a job as a doctor. He was well received as he had the necessary documents, that is, his medical diploma. During this time, refugees received supplies from the Red Cross via Iran, so the conditions for refugees was pretty good. Money was not much value, however. The stores sold products at official prices, were empty, and the prices at the local bazaar, which was the marketplace, were about 10 times the official price. Here's more from my father's memoirs about his time in the Soviet Union.
The salaries were far from enough to live on. During the war, the only product that one received at a fixed price was the ration of bread and very infrequently a ration of sugar. All other foods, such as meat, butter, flour, vegetables, and fruit, one had to grow himself or buy at exorbitant prices at the bazaar. Local people had gardens. Some had cows or goats, chickens, etc., and could get along without buying food at the bazaars. There was also a well-developed barter system. For example, one had a surplus of milk or butter. He could exchange it for meat or oil. A person who had a trade, a tailor or shoemaker, could supplement his income by taking on work after his regular working hours. For his work at home, he demanded a bazaar-like pay in money or barter in food products. Life was extremely difficult for one who had to feed the family and rely on only one salary.
As I read this, I can conclude that he was lucky he was a doctor, as families would offer him food instead of money when he made house calls. Soon he had a private practice and was seeing both Soviet and Polish patients, but soon things got worse. In April 1943, the German army discovered mass graves of thousands of executed Polish military officers in Katyn, Poland. The Soviets said that these officers had escaped prison camps. The discovery of the massacre precipitated the severance of diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile. Anyone who didn't go with the Polish army that was mobilizing in the Zambul area were effectively considered non-citizens. The conditions for refugees who were mainly Jewish Poles got worse. I'll continue from his memoirs.
Without the salary for my employment in the Polish clinic, and without the rations provided by the office of the Polish representative, my only source of income remained my medical practice. Every day I was receiving calls to see patients. I did not have a formal office, and I would usually see patients in their homes. In Zambul, the patients who called a doctor were usually quite sick. There was no transportation, and the doctor had to go see the patient at home. To go meant to walk. Distances were quite large. In the wintertime, the days were short. The walk was difficult because of the wet clay and the unpaved streets. In the wintertime, I could make only 2 house calls a day, at most 3 calls, if 2 were close by. What was time-consuming was the walk. It took 1 hour to reach the patient's house, ½ hour for the visit, and 1 hour the return walk. Most of the Polish patients could not pay the doctor. In the first winter after Katyn, many Polish refugees were suffering from malnutrition. There were no more food rations to keep them alive. Only those who had personal belongings that could be sold in the bazaar could purchase food at black market prices. Everything had an intrinsic value at the bazaar. Especially valuable were foreign things brought from Poland by the refugees. Old dresses, bed linen, blankets, shoes could be sold and converted into food. When these ran out, there was the threat of malnutrition and starvation. In the case of a Polish refugee without a family, I tried to mobilize good neighbors, Polish and Russian, to help the patient to receive proper feeding. The first winter in Zambul after Katyn was a tragic winter for many. Not only was there starvation, there was always the threat of disease, as the irrigation ditches in Zambul served as source of drinking water and also as sewers. There were large outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid fever.
I can only think that this must have been devastating for my father. There were no antibiotics or any of the current drugs we have to treat his patients, so these diseases were deadly. However, my father had patience, so he could still feed his parents. This is how they survived the 4 years until the war ended. I can only think that because he had this piece of paper, the diploma, they were able to survive while many succumbed to disease or starvation and didn't come back. There are many instances of how the Soviets put great importance on papers with official-looking stamps. But among the other papers, my sister and I found nothing was more significant than his diploma and his passport from Canada, which you see here, the land that accepted him in the 1950s as a person without a country. It was poignant when we found his immigration papers and his first passport after he took Canadian citizenship. However, not only did his diploma help save him and his parents, it also allowed him to find a home where he was valued as a doctor after his odyssey in Eastern Europe. There is really meaning and power in a piece of paper. My search to get a complete picture of my father took me to 3 countries where I gained information, but nothing had as much meaning and was as powerful as the treasure trove of his documents, which included his handwritten memoirs that told me the whole story. And I feel that these documents have brought me closer to my father and helps me to carry on his legacy of helping others as an educator. Thank you for tuning in and listening to my father's story. And I also want to give a special thanks to Alan Taylor for narrating the excerpts. Thank you so much. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook page and other social media to hear who the next speaker will be in the coming weeks. Thank you again. And I'm happy to take any questions that are out there. I'm sure there must be some questions.
There are. Thank you so much.
Oh, cool.
Okay. The first one, what was it like for you going through your father's memoir and retracing his steps?
It was pretty emotional. Like I said, my father died when I was 19, and there was really a big mystery about him because, as I said in the presentation, he really didn't talk much about it. It came out in bits and pieces, like, oh, there was this episode where my grandfather and grandmother were, when they were emigrating from the Soviet Union, from Warsaw. They ended up in Warsaw after the war. Warsaw was pretty much destroyed, and there were pogroms in Warsaw, so they couldn't stay there. So my grandparents ended up on a train. Let me backtrack. My uncles all were in France, so they were able to, through the Red Cross, they found my father and his grandparents in the Soviet Union, and they sent them visas to emigrate to France. So my grandparents, after they were in Warsaw, ended up going to Paris. But there was this story of how my grandfather, the train stopped in Prague, and my grandfather ended up wanting to go see the synagogue that was still there. And so he almost missed the train. So my father told me that story because I was looking for a thing to put down in an English paper in 11th grade. So it would come out in like little bits and pieces. And then, obviously, when we would visit my family in France, nobody talked about the past. Nobody. My grandmother didn't, even though I didn't understand her. She only spoke Yiddish. But nobody, it was like we all lived in the present. There were children. My sister and I were very young. It was all living in the present. So when I went through these memoirs, I'm like, holy moly. How did this person, like I said in the beginning, who was my dad, go through all of this? How did he survive? So I had to, it was sort of like a mystery to me. So it was uncovering bits and pieces of my dad, which was pretty emotional for me. I'm sure that was a long answer to a very short question.
No, but it was probably an overwhelming experience to kind of go through.
It was very overwhelming. And my trip to Vilnius was very overwhelming because it just felt like it was filled with ghosts of all the Jews that had lived there. I mean, it really was the Jerusalem of Eastern Europe because it had over 120 synagogues. I think a large percentage of the population there was Jewish. And then when I went there in 2003, there was only one synagogue, the Choral Synagogue, which you saw a picture in the presentation. That actually is still standing. But they had 120 and they went down to one, and they're really trying hard to rebuild the Jewish community. But, how do you do that?
I believe you had mentioned this isn't as well known of a story. Is there any sort of, I guess, resources or like documentary books or anything that people should look to learn more?
Well, I've been actually doing that. Most of the articles that I found were that I had to, I work at a college, so I have access to journal articles. And a lot of it is, most of the websites that I found were Polish and Lithuanian, because between the years of let's just put it this way. When Stalin became the head of the Soviet government, he started purging everybody. He was paranoid. He just like, oh, okay, I'm going to kill all my generals. Oops, I don't have generals now. What am I going to do? I'm going to deport, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and Poland got hit really hard before World War II. They, like I said, millions of people were thrown in gulags and deported. So a lot of the sites that I found were from Lithuania, because they really honor the fact that they had a loss of population until his death in 1953. So there were deportations going on after World War II of ethnic Lithuanians and Latvians and Estonians. So a lot of the websites, you'll have to Google deportations by the Soviet Union, really. There are a few books. There's something called Shades of Gray that's been written by a Lithuanian author. There are some memoirs by children that were deported with their parents and survived in Siberia. But a lot of it was from my dad's own research. He did a lot of research when he wrote his memoirs. But like I said, it's Lithuanian, Polish websites. There aren't really any films. I saw one film a long time ago about the Odyssey, but to be honest, I don't remember the name.
Okay. So what brought you to the point now of sharing his story?
Oh my gosh. Do you have half an hour? Oh my goodness. So after I read his memoirs, life happens. And now in the last couple years, I've been fully pushing to get these memoirs published. So one of the avenues for telling the story is the Second Generation Speakers Bureau. And since I'm also a filmmaker and I teach film, this is perfect, for me. It's sort of right up my alley. And since, I don't see a lot of exhibits in Holocaust museums in the United States concerning this area, how Jews survived in the Soviet Union, I decided, you know what, put my hat in the ring. I'll decide to become a speaker. And, the first generation was still alive at the time I first approached the museum. So there was they were full up basically. So now the second generation is telling their stories. I joined at that point, but I'm still looking for a publisher for my dad's memoirs.
Well, hopefully you find it soon.
I hope so.
One last question right now. What do you want people to take away from hearing this? Like, what's the most important thing?
That this type of fear and intolerance can happen again. And the more we learn about our past, the better off we're going to be about not repeating it. I mean, I'm all about education. So like I said, if you don't know about the past, if you don't know about all the genocides, like this one was a genocide, that we're just going to keep repeating our mistakes, and we're not going to stand up to people that are doing these evil things. So, we have to face this history in order to have a more just future, I guess.
That's a powerful note to end it on. I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. Stay tuned for the next speaker.